Okay, these are the last two presentations. First one is Daniel with attacks against Ukraine OT. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, let me see. Yeah, we're good. Maybe this one. So, thanks to everyone for staying here through the day. We're about to get to an end, just two more talks. Bear with us a couple more minutes. And today I want to talk to you about one of the most interesting events, actually the latest OT security event that we have seen basically the latest that has been actually documented, which is something interesting given the very few number of cases. But for that reason, I'll just give a bit more context before getting into the topic. First of all, I'm Daniel Kapellmann. Nice to meet you. I'm actually Mexican, live in the United States, lived a bit in Germany. Right now I live in Netherlands, and I'm working with Google Mandiant. So basically, if you know any of the both companies, now we're basically one. And basically, my specialty is cyber-physical, whatever we call OT-ICS, which I'm going to mention in a second, and information operations recently. So before getting in the topic, I think it's always good to get everyone on the same level. So I wanted to ask, is there anyone here, or could you please raise your hand if you work in something related to OT or ICS? 1, 2. And yes, he says maybe, but I know he's yes. Okay, so 3 people that work in that. Okay, now, could you raise your hand if you know what OT ICS is? Nice, okay, there's many more people, that's amazing. But still, then bear with me a minute, I'm just gonna give some general background so everyone gets to the same level. So basically, for OT, operational technology, ICS, industrial control systems, what we refer to is basically the combination of computing systems and engineering systems that we use to support physical processes. Physical processes can be, for example, water facility, energy facility, cars, basically anything that is going to have an actual physical implication in the world. What's interesting about this discipline is that, of course, we do look at the same way as IT security, we do look into computers and whatnot, but we have a little more complications in a different way. We have all the older devices, we have very specific protocols, proprietary protocols, many different vendors, none of them talk to each other, and the field has existed only like for 12, 13 years. So basically, we're kind of like much younger and looking into different disciplines at the same time. So a bit of more background still for those that are not that familiar still with OT-ICS. This diagram is what we call the Purdue model. The Purdue model basically is, the idea is that it shows you from the top is the office, let's say, the IT systems, which is most of what we discuss normally in cybersecurity. And everything below that line is what we call more OT. It begins with what is normally a demilitarized zone, which contains a couple servers. We call them historians. The name is funny for some, but yes, it's called historians. And those historians are used basically to connect the data, pull data from the process outside, and sometimes let something inside. It's very rare. Normally, they try to limit what happens in there. It's not like that's normally connected to internet and external or nothing that you should be able to be poking, but sometimes it could happen. And then the lower levels, the next one is basically, it's more abstract, less clever machines. We're talking about controllers, what we call PLCs, RTUs, whatever, devices. And those devices, what they do is they are less clever than the computer. They say yes, no, they say 1, 0, they say, okay, it happens, it doesn't happen, temperature must be at this, or set alert. So it's very reliable, but basically much less complex. And in there we have what we call their HMI, which is just between us, HMI, human-machine interface, is basically just the visualization. They also call computers different, EWR, engineering workstation, but it means endpoint, just in there. And lastly, those devices that you have at that level communicate with the field devices, which are basically actuators, sensors that collect data from the process and go and act in the physical world. That was a very quick summary. It's not getting into everything, but I think at least it should be giving an idea of where I am going to be focusing. I'm going to be focusing on that lower level. So the last piece of context is this timeline, what you see here. You will see that it's very different than what you would expect in IT security. This is the full history of OT, almost. I mean, of course, there might be small pieces that we could add, but basically, as you can tell, the number of incidents is quite limited. The number of events where there was actually malware targeted to some basically physical process has been, you can count it with your fingers still. The first one, the most famous, that's already in museums and whatnot, Stuxnet, basically malware deployed against Iranian nuclear centrifuges to delay the process. Basically, well, it impacted by affecting the movement in the centrifuges and eventually delayed the process for multiple years. So there was some physically destructive in there. Then there was a period where there was nothing that exciting, vulnerability discovery, we say here. People started looking into that. There was research. It became kind of exciting and new. But actually, until 2015, 2016, we started seeing something happen, which was a couple of power outages, both in Ukraine, both around Christmas time, both attributed to an actor that you will hear a ton about in this presentation, basically Sandworm, that is basically Russian sponsored. And then 2017, there goes a big change. We get the biggest event ever. This biggest event was something called Triton. We looked, the team from Andean responded, went to do the incident response. It was energy facility, well, nuclear energy facility in the Middle East. And basically what happened is the actor reached to the point where they had control of what we call the Safety Instrumented System, SIS, Triconics. Has anyone used that Triconics here? I wouldn't expect it because it's the most specific thing. It would be the most rare thing that you would expect. Normally, it's going to be an engineer using proprietary protocols. There's no information available outside. Only specific organizations can have it. The vendor knows and tracks every time an organization have it. And yet the actor was able to go all the way from corporate network to OT, go to Triconics, spend years trying to develop something, and actually being able almost to conduct the attack, except with some mistakes. But at that point, it looked that everything was going to be more complicated. Like OT was going to be like Stuxnet or Triton, and then we were going to look at very sophisticated malware with large engineering teams that went for the most specific tiny piece of your infrastructure. But something started changing, and it actually went more simple instead. We started looking at the time when post-compromise ransomware became more interesting of a thing. You have it with operators. It started impacting sometimes some of the production processes, most often on the data side, but in very few cases there was impact on the OT side. We started looking at crimes of opportunity, people just looking at OT that was exposed in internet, and just because they started getting familiar with the different protocols that were used, the different tools that they could use, how they can poke with these systems, what they could do. And we started seeing it with very little impact, really. I mean, it could be, yeah, very simple, really. And then we get to 2022, 2023. That's when it all started getting exciting. In the past, we were looking for data. We were waiting for the big event to happen. And suddenly, we had so much more than we could handle, and then it starts becoming quicker. So at first, 2022, we covered a couple big cases. What happened in those years? In the beginning of the year, the invasion in Ukraine began, right? And given the main actors that we had in doing this type of attack are related to that region, that's when we started looking into more of that. We looked at 2 different cases. I'm not going to go in depth, but if you like, I recommend you to get the names, and we have blogs for both of us, for both of those. We also started looking into hacktivism. Hacktivism changing from the old times of I'm going to DDoS and erase your website to something like I'm going to try to impact your physical process and sometimes even work with states. That's a different talk almost, but very exciting in case you're into that. And then lastly, in 2023, innovation. We started seeing new cases, something that, finally started looking different. Like we saw the change during the process of the conflict. In here we have a couple new piece of malware, Cosmic Energy. Again, it was a different talk. Vulkan leaks, I'm going to talk about those. And the most important here is the Sandworm attack. That is what we're going to be talking about today. So to know about that, the first thing is, who is Sandworm? The 2 power outages that I mentioned basically were Sandworm, related in Ukraine. In Destroyer 2 was also related to Sandworm. And then the most interesting is that the attacker hasn't only done this type of like cyber physical attack, but actually they've done everything. They have been associated to a lot of high profile events. They're, how they say, is basically like a multi-range group, you know, kind of like pretty much like full and consistent, that has worked in everything from, I mean, like regular attacks, a ton of wipers. They've done a ton during the conflict right now in Ukraine, even influence operations, like information operations, entirely not really like borderline cybersecurity or not. Basically, they have done it. And we've tracked them since around 2009. For those that don't know also, the name of Sandworm was, and this is just like old case, because in some of the old malware, they used to add in the strings of the code, they used to add names from the movies, from the Dune, basically. So that's why where it became so legendary. If you're into that, there's a very good book called Sandworm, just letting you know. The other interesting thing about this group, did I click? Oh, no. So the other interesting thing about this group is we started looking through the beginning of the, well, through these 2 years of the ongoing conflict. And we realized that they were changing a bit from doing very specific malware like in the past and moving into this new system of like building more tooling quicker in different modules and then deploying the modules so that they could go and conduct different attacks. Although, I mean, like here we have the full range, but I'm going to focus in this talk on 2 specifically. Living off the land, which is probably the biggest stake of this talk. I will get to that in a second, but basically using binaries, using tools, using anything that is already available in the environment of the target to go and conduct the attack. And the second one is disrupt and deny. Basically, in this case, well, in this image we were mentioning wipers, but I'm going to go a bit more for the wipers. From my perspective, what I do care is about the physical impacts, like basically them being able to make a change in the environment. In this case, as I will mention later, but basically turn off the light for some period of time. Lastly, well, telegraphing success, I want to mention it. That has nothing to do with the talk, but I really love it, which is also the narrative that is added after these attacks. Sometimes when there is no impact, it makes you feel that there was. Sometimes when there was an impact, it helps you amplify. So just a fun fact, very exciting. And the other thing from Sandworm is when you look at it from an OT ICS perspective, particularly from control systems, what you're going to realize is that all of those cases that have that, well, like, I'm blanking, but basically that blue thing on the top corner, if you realize all of those say Sandworm, that is a timeline of Croatia Nexus attacks impacting OT. You're going to see that most of it is Sandworm, so basically one of our favorites to look into, and definitely one of the groups where we expect the most from. So now, the attack. Let's get specifically into what happened. Well, here it already says the result was disrupting power for some period of time in Ukraine, in a specific region, a specific case. Obviously, it's not like all the country goes out. That's not real, at least hopefully right now. But yeah, basically, it proves basically how they did it. And the first thing is some quick infomercial. For this, we also wanted to thank, basically on Ukraine, the work that we did was also in collaboration with the SBU. So basically, as they were going during the conflict, they were looking into this as well, and eventually helped us to, and allowed us to go and make this public. So we're very excited. And also the government of UK, which basically funded this type of work as part of the funds that they do to support the conflict in Ukraine. So, the attack. Okay, now let's get to the big description. High-level description, what's the point? We call it a multi-event, basically, just because there were like different stages of the attack that were entirely different. The most interesting thing is that they use this living off the land techniques, particularly to turn off the power. And the interesting thing is living off the land techniques is something not that new and exciting when you just say it, but when you say it in OT, it's the first time it has been seen. Because normally it has to be so utilizing malware that is fairly sophisticated, understands the environment. You will see in a bit some of the conditions. But in this case, it was basically, you know, like a very simple attack, and yet it actually did make this physical impact. The next thing is, well, the interesting part is the attacker actually arrived there like at least 3 months before. That's when we saw the beginning of the attack, something like more regular. And then after 3 months, all of a sudden they decide to go and run this last part of the attack, which is the one we focus on, which actually was basically in parallel or coincided with the time when we saw these missile strikes, specifically in that region. So it's also one of the ways in which it shows not only an attack, but actually the attack within the context of an armed conflict. And lastly, well, I mean, of course, this shows growing maturity. It's basically making it more feasible to conduct this type of attacks. But for that, I have more evidence through the process. So this is basically the attack life cycle. It is very sad because we don't have it all. As you can tell, definitely we have no idea on initial compromise. In the beginning, you can go and take a look at the malware. I'm not going to focus so much in that because the most exciting part is just the end. As you can tell, the first 2 or 3 months are basically for gaining access, for basically getting control, foothold, whatnot. But basically, in the end, the complete mission, that is the part that is very exciting for OT. What it says here, ISO image with microSCADA capability. What is microSCADA? Let's get a bit more detail about that. So microSCADA. MicroSCADA is actually, how the name says, SCADA, so supervisory control and data acquisition, basically a specific type of products that you use for controlling engineering devices across a broad, how to say, like across a broad regional distribution. So normally this means that you could be different areas, right? This software is very interesting, actually. MicroSCADA is, it belongs to Hitachi right now. It used to be an ABB product. And it is very interesting because actually, well, according to the numbers that we found around, this is not going to be the most scientific, but like just looking around papers and whatever, it says that it is like 10% of the energy in the world goes to at least one of these devices. They're very popular, very common. And basically what it does is, yeah, it's like the software that you utilize to then communicate with the controllers, and then the controllers are the ones that are going to be basically controlling your energy. It's also used for different industries. It can be for water, it can be for manufacturing, it can be whatever. It's not only energy. And now the next step of microSCADA is the fun fact. As I said, most of the things that we use, probably you would never have heard about it. I don't expect anyone to have heard of SCILz, but probably someone has heard from the 2 or 3 people, maybe has seen it. Basically, SCILz is the programming language that you use for communicating with microSCADA. The documentation, there is public documentation. This one is not as secret and stable. It's just basically unknown because unless you have a reason to interact with a microSCADA, probably you've never used it. But basically what it allows you to do is to basically develop the interface that you're going to use. With that interface, it basically allows you to make a ton of connections between how your operator works with process, with data, with the system. Basically, anything that you want to automate with your controllers is going to go through the communication of basically microSCADA using SCILz, and then that's how you're going to be making control of your process. And this is the attack. This is actually the most interesting. If there's something like how to we put a lot of thought normally into how to describe them, so that because it's the most exciting part. Basically, what we saw in here, what happened is basically that a.iso, basically virtual machine, was deployed in a hypervisor. Okay, and so basically it contained launch VVS, which launched NBAT, and SCLIC.exe. SCLIC.exe is the interesting part. SCLIC.exe is basically just the module they were using to communicate with the microSCADA server, which was installed in that hypervisor. S1.txt were the instructions, basically literally a TXT file that has the list of instructions that the microSCADA server had to communicate to the controllers. So if you realize here, there doesn't seem to be any malware. It was just basically they were able to find a creative way to go and run a file that was telling the system to do something that it was not supposed to do. The most sad part of this for us is that S1.txt died. Basically, we could not recover the commands. We do not know specifically what they wanted to do. We know what the result was, but we cannot tell to what extent they were planning to do that versus other actions, which I'll get into in a second. But basically, yeah, the rest we were able to go back and identify. And then the last piece of that is once you drop this SCLIC.exe, it runs in microSCADA server, goes to RTU, which is a type of controller, let's say, remote terminal unit, is a device that then is going to communicate to your different controllers at the plant level. And that is basically the one that was going to say if you were going to be opening or closing your breakers. And that is basically how they reached out to basically turn off the power. The other interesting thing here is when they did this, yeah, of course, the microSCADA, like we obviously collaborated with the vendor and everything, and they were very clear, just please clarify that it was end of life. So apparently, yeah, if they had a newer version of the product, probably this wouldn't happen. So it's definitely something relevant to change, but obviously it's not so easy to change it in the back end. So just letting you know. And yeah, of course, there is now some additional documentation from the vendor on how to fix this. The other thing in here is, to clarify, it's basically how did it run. Basically, they didn't have to go and execute in the hypervisor because it was set to run it as if it was a CD-ROM, basically. So given the configuration, they just literally dropped the file. It started executing. It dropped information, told microSCADA what it had to do. Then microSCADA told the RTUs. The RTUs tell the additional devices. Then the power goes off. And so from here, like from the full attack, then the important thing is the leaving of the land. Like I insist, like that's basically what we're definitely highlighting a ton. And the reason is because, well, first of all, it allows to decrease resources and basically the time that you need to do an attack. It's basically much easier if you do something like this than that if you spent, I don't know, 3 years developing a piece of very specific malware that you're only going to use one time. The second thing is decreasing likelihood of detection. I mean, because it's basically using something that already exists. And the last one is basically handling these proprietary OT protocols. Basically, it does not have to go and figure out how to run the protocol again. The program is already doing it. The only thing they had to figure out is how to use SCILz. And then they figure out how to use this specific programming language. Then they go, they can tell it what to do, and then voila. This fits pretty well into the full strategy that we've been seeing during the conflict, but actually comes with more implications of like at the actual level and what the capabilities are. So the implications here in terms of the attacker. What we see here, first of all, is like the attack, even though it sounds very simple in the sense of like that small process that you saw in there, the complicated part in here is basically all the knowledge that you need to have to be able to conduct one of these attacks. The first piece is, well, substation operations. Actually, also, just to give credits, this is from Simant, who is one of our consultants. He decided to put up some additional blogging with this, and it seemed very interesting insights. So I decided to add it. Basically, in here, you need to know, for example, well, equipment hierarchy, basically which equipment talks to which other and at what level. At the industrial level, it's going to be very interesting because you're not going to have all the logs and visibility that you normally have to be able to communicate. So the first thing is that knowledge that they had also with the architecture, the knowledge that they have about the actual system, about how it works in that specific facility, about where everything is connected, and about how they can go and conduct the specific attack. Second one is control logic. Well, that's basically, again, more specific kind of like into what are the types of communication that you use at the industrial level, and the communication protocols. In here, if you realize the communication between the microSCADA and the RTU is something that's called IEC 104 or IEC 101. Those specific protocols are very interesting, and oftentimes when you're trying to work with them, you're going to need to know a ton of different values about the target. So for example, in a different attack that we track that's called Cosmic Energy, we work with some of these products, and we realized that in these cases, there were a ton of values that are unique to the facility or to the vendor or to the engineering that is setting up the devices, and they're going to need to have access to that information so they can go and set it up. Lastly, of course, knowledge about the SCILz language and vulnerabilities. In this case, the fact that they were able to identify how to run the script. Somewhere in that ends, basically, yeah, I mean, like knowledge about the process. By the process, I mean basically, if you just tell one device, hey, go and trip the circuit breakers, you don't know what's going to happen. You need to know, like, in the actual process and the actual system, what could be the implication, which requires knowledge about the specific industrial process. microSCADA API, that's another interesting one because that's basically the access and how they were able to deploy the initial executable. And basically, that's also some additional knowledge they need. And okay, I mean, I'm just going to summarize device identification. Basically, what were the devices you need? Figure out how to trigger it, instructions, commands. I know this is probably too much on skills. It made the point. You need a ton of skills that are not that common. But the interesting thing in here is, once you have all those skills, then you need to decide also what attack you want to do. And how it's going to look like, based, for example, on the experience of our red teamers, you do need to sit down and look at the process on the one side, what you want to generate. You need to look at the IT on the one side. You need to look at the OT. Then you need to put it all together and figure out where it overlaps. And based on that, you can make decisions. So in here, the fact that we don't have the instructions of the S1 TXT, basically the one that they sent, brings up the questions. First question, were they intended to do something single or coordinated? Were they looking into a specific breaker, a specific location, a specific region, a specific place? Or were they looking at doing this at a larger scale, which maybe worked or didn't work? The second one is cascading effects. Maybe if you make a small change in a physical process, it can change many things at the lower level. So you do need to know what is going on in that facility. Probably they had visibility before. Probably they knew already how it was operating. That is another of the big questions. And lastly, time-based logic. Of course, they need to figure out how to time it in such a way that it happens at the time they want, particularly when you're going through a conflict and you want to pair it up with other types of events. We'll never know, unfortunately. And then, well, just bring back to the Sandworm piece. Then what this shows is basically pre-invasion, we had very complex type of malware, once again. Post-invasion, we see this super quick type of change of trying to apply basically the attack to decompose it, to make it in small pieces. And the interesting thing here is we see the actor recognizing how to generate this type of new type of attacks for OT, which I insist this is the first time and only that it has happened. Finding capabilities and leverage OT infrastructure. This is something that if it happens at IT level, we recognize it's not that new. When it happens at OT, I hope we don't start seeing it more often. And if we do, we'll have more to discuss here. But so where this is coming from, which is the other, to put it kind of like in the big picture, we like not just like to stay into one attack, but actually where this is coming from is basically, well, like, yeah, the increasing development of capabilities we saw in the beginning through the years, right? Which ironically, once again, it didn't result in more complex attacks, but actually more simple, yet more actionable. To substantiate this, the first thing I brought is the Balkan leaks. That's one of the things that we also found in 2023. We covered it with basically a specific group of journalists, and it refers to a series of papers associated to Russian Ministry of Defense, which basically what they were showing is different modules that they were working with a specific contractor, NTC Balkan. And basically it was decomposed in different pieces. One of them, or the main one for right now, it was focused mainly on OT capabilities. Another one was for information operations. Another one was for collecting data from many different systems, putting it together, basically trying to put in pieces the capabilities they have. And from this, actually, we have an excerpt. This is like real. This, I didn't come up with this. It comes from those papers. It was saying some of the capabilities that they were trying to develop, which go perfectly in line with what we discussed a couple of minutes ago. Basically, as you can say here, interest in real systems, manipulating, causing traffic virus, blah, 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 destruction. Pipelines is the same, closing valves, shutting down pumps. Very similar to what we're seeing in this case, particularly in energy. This shows, again, the modularity of the capabilities. Which what we refer with this modularity is by separating the small pieces of the attack so that they don't have to commit just multiple years to be able to do something like this where they actually impact the physical world, but rather put it in pieces. And that's why we've been seeing that their malware actually has been kind of like changing. Most recently, you've seen they always are abusing insecure protocols. They're always using libraries. Like there are open source libraries for interacting with OT protocols. And they're going to make your life much easier. You can even hunt for those if that's something you're into. And Python for malware development packaging. That's very weird. That's another of the things that is going to sound very normal. It's like, yeah, Python is everywhere. But when you're actually in the facility, it's most likely not supposed to be there. And if it is, they will know, and they will restrict everything you use, everything you want to run. So it is very weird because oftentimes in these attacks, they were run in places where Python was not allowed. So what was Python executable doing there? And that's how actually we found some very interesting samples. And well, the last piece to evidence this type of modular component of OT malware is basically, this is actually going a bit back, like actually 2022. But this is probably one of the most, how to say, like robust cases we've seen. What you see on the right is something called in controller. That was like the main thing we were working in 2022. The interesting thing of in controller was that for the first time it brought to us this idea of modularity that we saw in this attack. And it was divided in these three pieces. As you can tell, well, actually, this is going to be probably, woo, that's going to be more elegant. So basically, it had three different big modules. One of them was Omshell that was designed to interact with products from a company called Omron, a Japanese company, also with very specific controllers. The second one was Code Call. Basically, that was for some Schneider Electric products. And then Tagrun, which was to run at the OPC UA server level. So that's more like what I mentioned at the beginning, historian, more like basically data communication. We found, or we acquired or received or whatever, it's those three executables, those three packages. Actually, you don't receive like the piece of malware in the hand, you receive like a bunch of files and have to figure out what it is. And decided to put it out in this diagram so that it showed more or less at what level it would work. It doesn't mean that this was a single attack, it was different modules, but it showed how one of the modules could be used to try to infiltrate, to get espionage data, to try to understand the process, to try to get access. All of the things that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago for the knowledge you need to do this attack. The second and the third, you need them to interact actually at the controller level. So if I was to think kind of like from a strategic perspective, I would say that what we discussed right now, this new capability, would be just one more module here on the right saying microSCADA. And then that way it is that as from an attacker perspective, is you're looking into a victim, you don't have to look anymore for the very specific malware that's only designed for your victim, but instead you have to look at them from a holistic perspective, understand what devices they have, how the process runs, and then choose the different modules you want to use. The same with these vulnerabilities. Normally for OT, we don't even talk about vulnerabilities because you don't need them. Most often, the device is going to give you what you need. But these two vulnerabilities are actually Rockwell automation, control logic devices. Those were released, I think, 2023 as well. I had them in the first slide. And those ones actually were just basically the same. They were specific vulnerabilities identified to interact and get control of this type of systems. So as you can tell, it's not the first time we see something like that modular. There is this pattern that we have seen in very complex and interesting malware, but everything is moving in such a way that it becomes more easily to deploy, such as the events that we just described. And so to wrap up with this, I just wanted to bring, first of all, some takeaways. The first one is, of course, on the growing maturity that we're seeing at the offensive level. The new things that we're observing at the OT level, which, as you can tell, for 10, 15 years, we didn't think could happen. And right now, we're getting it more simple. So if anything, that's something that we're going to be expecting more in the future, as well as the use of living off the land, right? The second one for SCILz, yeah, basically, the attackers showed the capability to adapt a lot to the environment, different software to basically what they were doing. That is basically that we're also probably going to need to start ramping up, because from a security perspective, we might need to start understanding this type of protocol so that then we can go and try to defend. And yeah, of course, Sandworm will be back again. We're going to be seeing more from them. From general recommendations, like that we have in case you ever run into that, of course, this is actually, most of them are very generic and are going to sound very, very normal. But I wanted to point out something specific that actually we were discussing earlier. That is the fact of application logging for microSCADA. Application logging sounds very basic. I know it's most often probably you're going to say it should happen. Why isn't it there? At the industrial level, it's not always there. And it is not as simple. So you have to do multiple changes in the architecture. It might be very costly. There might be many different protocols. Many of them might be proprietary. You might need to hire different specialized products, some of which are not compatible with others. So that is actually a big challenge, but definitely worth keeping in mind. And my favorite here is actually about identifying other applications just like SCILz. Just like microscada. So in that sense, the interesting thing is like probably from here, maybe 1 or 2 people at most would have heard about the name microscada. So it sounds like something, okay, it's interesting, it's new, they did it once, it's not gonna happen, whatever. But actually there are many different, like applications from different vendors, like it might be, I don't know, Siemens, it might be Rockwell Automation, it might be in this case microscada, whatever. And all of those products are things that no one really is looking into because it requires 2 different types of knowledge. It requires from the OT perspective, from IT perspective. They do have it at the vendor level, but at the security level, it's a big opportunity in research. Actually, when you go to OT events, there's barely no one looking at these type of components, but still they, based on what we saw with this attack, seem to be one of the main possibilities for attack vectors. And on those lines, I'll leave you with just some small candy. If there's anyone here hunting, we have more like in the blog, but basically just dropping a couple rules in here. I would definitely encourage you, if you're interested by the topic, would like to see more, would like to go and take a look what you find, I would definitely go and look a bit more into this type of unique type of tooling, like SCILz particularly. In this case, that microscada binaries. And the idea is basically if you're able to find in wherever sources you have this type of traffic, then you might start taking a look. And if you're the one that finds the next, I don't know, like the 8th OT attack, then please let us know. We'll be super excited. So that's all from me. And thanks for everything.
Wait, anyone questions? Oh.
Thank you. How did you do attribution to GRU?
Okay, well, to GRU, that's a bit more complicated. That's like a very old case of Sandworm. Okay, the specific attribution to GRU, so to keep the full context, Mandiant specifically does attribution like this style. Most often we do not go beyond the origin level. So for example, we would go just like Russia level, whatever. Sandworm is a very long story. I would definitely lie if I tried to tell you like the full story because I wasn't there. I do point out, if you want, there's the book called Sandworm that might give you some more details because that is, you'll be talking of a sample of a large number of attacks. What I can tell is in general how we do the type of attribution. Like for example, one case where I do have the knowledge is Triton, the case that I was mentioning. We attributed back to a Russian research laboratory. We went back to a laboratory. And the way in which we did that attribution was because we started tracking the malware that the actor used before the OTPs. And we started looking at it in Malware Analysis Sandbox. And we kept on tracking the actor for basically over a year until one day the actor dropped one file that had basically a path that contained a very specific handle. So we looked into that handle and started realizing that only one person had it, and this person was publishing in as hacker magazines. This person happened to be located in Moscow. This person was working for this laboratory. This person was claiming to do research for malware and whatever. And then when we started looking into that, we don't get into people, like we avoid that, but we were able to point the connection between the timing of the attacks, between the specific person, between the groups that this person was collaborating with, like verified, and also some, for example, IP address that was present at the time of the attacks in these very specific environments, and also reading our blogs by mistake, and that just happened to have the specific attribution, the name of the institution, because by mistake, operational mistake, obviously they didn't remove it. Once we published, they removed it, now they don't exist. But yeah, it's a case by case. In the case of Sandworm, yeah, I can connect you with someone that has a story better than me.
Nothing, mute. Okay, thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.